Today we're embarking on a new series. We will be in the series for so buckle your seatbelts because we'll be there together for about 40 sessions, which will of course be regularly and continuously interrupted by all of the Jewish holidays that occur in the midst of the next 40 days that we'll have. So we're going to be here roughly for a year. And we shall be together in the Gospel of Mark. I'm very excited to take us through the Gospel of Mark. This series is called The Jewish Journey Through the Gospel of Mark. And we're going to go verse by verse, as we do, through this very important, critical, and essential Gospel. And it's a Jewish journey, you know why? Because we are a Messianic congregation. I am a fourth generation Jewish believer who will be examining the text, each component of the text, through the grid of Jewish culture and background and practice and, of course, history. So we will go together through Mark's Gospel, Jewishly. If you're watching at home, this is a great time for you to subscribe, press the like button, do all the stuff that they tell you to do on YouTube. It helps our numbers to grow. It helps YouTube to spread our videos far and wide. And if you value our content and want other people to receive it, then please do those things and even leave a comment if you'd like, because that kind of interaction really helps. So I want to introduce the book. We're only going to introduce the book today. We're not even getting into the text today. But I want to prepare you for the text. And for that, we must answer some questions. The first question regarding the Gospel of Mark, well, it may seem an obvious one. Who wrote the book of Mark? Well, it says in my Bible that Mark wrote the book. This is accepted convention, but is there any evidence? And you'll find nothing. You'll look in vain inside the book to see a statement where Mark says, hey, guys, I wrote this. This is my narrative. It's not like Paul or Peter, that we just spent time in his epistle, 5 chapters of 1 Peter, that Peter's very clear, it's me. Several times he says it's me. Paul's letters, he says it's me. But this is not an epistle. This is narrative. What is the evidence that Mark is the author? First of all, the title. The title. We have no existing manuscripts with competing titles. We're talking about I'm not talking about going to the Christian bookstore and picking up a New Testament, NASB, whatever, or King James, whatever, and saying, I have no existing manuscripts. There's no, I'm talking about ancient manuscripts, scrolls. We have no existing manuscripts with competing titles that differ from according to Mark. That is the title, right? According to Mark. And it is attributed to Mark traditionally. It is attributed to him. Right, so let's look at external evidence. So we have the title, but what about external evidence? But before we get to actually external evidence, let's talk about, all the ancient manuscripts that we have in existence that go back to the third, I think as far as we go with Mark is like 3rd century. So 200s, 300s, 4th century. We have tons of manuscripts, but nothing differ from according to Mark. So very, very early in church history, there is sufficient evidence to proceed. Any more evidence regarding authorship? How about the external evidence? Let's talk about external evidence. We have a long quote from a church father. It is one that is worth saving. Yeah, it's ancient, right? It dates to the 2nd century. That's the 100s. Right? It's a long quote, and we don't often get this kind of meaty, juicy background information, but Papias was a church father. Again, 2nd century. He lived between 60 and 135 AD. So, next generation from the Christians' first generation, from the apostles, from that first generation. Next generation, grandchildren's generation, right? He lived a good, long life. And we have this quotation. And he's actually quoting someone older than him. He's quoting the elder. And the elder, when Papias talks about the elder, he's talking about the Apostle John. So what he's telling us in this super long quote that I'm about to share with you is that he received this tradition, this explanation from his teacher, who happened to be the Apostle John. So he's a student of the Apostle John, and this is what he heard. So, the elder said, Mark became an interpreter of Peter. As many things as he remembered, he wrote down accurately, though certainly not in order, the things said or done by the Lord. For he neither heard the Lord, Mark, neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but he came later, as he said with reference to Peter, who taught whenever the need arose. But he did not teach according to the arrangement of the oracles of the Lord, with the result that Mark did not err when he thus wrote certain things as he recalled them. In other words, things are going to be out of order. So what? Okay, they're not wrong. They're just out of order. And I'm telling you they're out of order. Right? For he planned out one goal ahead of time, namely to leave out nothing which he heard and not to falsify any of the words of Peter. So, who is Mark? John Mark. He was an assistant to Paul and Barnabas. How many of you were here when we went through the book of Acts? Right? Remember John Mark. And this was their assistant, Paul and Barnabas' assistant, on the first missionary journey. And it's a big to-do because midway through the journey, he abandons them. And Paul and Barnabas had to proceed onward without their assistant. And when Paul and Barnabas prepared to go on the second journey, Barnabas wants to take his cousin John Mark. That's who Mark is. But Paul says, no way, he's a quitter. And they wind up, Paul and Barnabas, splitting into two different missionary journeys. One for Barnabas, one for Paul. Paul takes Silas. Remember Silvanus, who we looked at a couple of weeks ago at the very end of the book of 1 Peter. He's the either contributing author or most likely the amanuensis, the secretary, the scribe taking down 1 Peter, saying Paul's going to travel with Silas and not Barnabas. And Timothy serves the role of John Mark with Paul as his secretary and his assistant who's recording all the details. So what Papias is telling us is that the fact that Mark didn't write down all the things in order, that's going to be very important when we talk about the structure of the book. He doesn't write down the events in chronological order because Peter himself will tell the events as he remembers them. And as many of us tell stories, we tell them out of order. It's a very human thing to do. So Mark would just be faithful as a scribe in recording Peter's presentation of the gospel. So in that quotation, we have very strong external evidence, a very strong church tradition. It's very early, it doesn't get much earlier than the student of John. And he's telling us that Mark has recorded the teaching of Peter, the recollection, the sermons, the presentations of Peter that wind up serving as the structure, become the basis of the gospel, which is, while known as, according to Mark, behind Mark is the Apostle Peter. So he's not making anything up. Peter's stories, sermons, presentations don't include certain stories that were known about Jesus that may be in other Gospels. Well, Mark's not going to add them. He's not going to elaborate on them. He's not going to add anything that doesn't come directly from Peter, that wasn't substantiated by that particular apostle, in other words. So when we talk about external evidence, we have Mark and the background of Peter. But now internal evidence, we have authorship. We know that Mark and Peter knew one another. How long? Almost 3 decades. We can begin with this passage that Mark includes in his gospel that none of the other 3 gospels include. And that passage is about the time that Jesus gets arrested, and there's a young disciple who was there, and he was wearing a sheet, and as he ran away, the sheet got caught, and he had to duck the cops naked. Right? That's the story. Exactly the kind of story that a self-effacing author like Mark, who wants to make sure that this little story gets in there. It's an embarrassing story, not a story to be proud of, but that's the beginning of Mark's journey. So he knows Peter for 3 decades. In fact, the upper room where the Passover was, that was Mark's house. Mark's mama's house, but Mark's house. So when we think about the Last Supper and Jesus sending John and Peter find a home where there's an upper room, and this is, according to Acts, the church tradition, is the home of John Mark and his mother. This is the meeting place where after the crucifixion, the resurrection, and ascension, Acts chapter 1 takes place in the upper room. Peter's arrested in Acts chapter 12, and when he has an angelic jailbreak, and he goes and runs to tell the church they're meeting, they're having a prayer meeting at John Mark's mother's house. So there is a very close association between John Mark and Peter. In 1 Peter chapter 5, just a few weeks ago we saw this. He called John Mark. Does anybody remember what he called John Mark? His son. His son. So although he washed out with Paul in the first missionary journey, apparently by the time Peter is written, and certainly by the time of the last epistles that Paul writes, in the late 50s, early 60s, John Mark is received once again by Paul and has become Peter's main assistant, his apprentice, his servant, his amanuensis, whatever you want to call it. John Mark is helping, his secretary. So close that he's his son. Well, structure of the Gospels itself, and we'll compare the bare bones outline of the Gospel of Mark with Peter's evangelistic witness presentation to Cornelius. Where is that evangelistic presentation to Cornelius found when the first Gentile comes to faith? It's found in the book of Acts in the chapter 10. Okay? This is the Gentile secret origin, so we should be very excited about that. So the same presentation, basically, that Mark makes to bring the first Gentiles into the church is the structure that we find here in the Gospel of Mark. There's a tremendous amount of similarity, tremendous amount of overlap. The Gospel structure is parallel to Peter's witness. So, when you speak on a circuit, I speak in a lot of churches, and I speak in a lot of the same stuff, different churches, different Sunday, different town, different whatever. But there is, as we go from church to church, sharing our greatest hits, we repeat them. The same stories, we repeat from church to church. If you were to follow me as my apprentice, as my assistant in different churches, you would hear a lot of the same presentations. You'd hear a lot of the same stories as we go from church to church, and that's exactly what happened with Peter. Some might even accuse me of using the same jokes over and over again. So, anyway, we have these very close associate of Peter called my son. We have these evidence, right? And Peter is presented in the gospel as the least, well, it's the least positive portrayal of Peter that we see in the gospel. So if you look at John, if you look at Luke, if you look at Matthew, Peter is presented in a particular way. But Mark has the least flattering presentation of Peter, which makes sense if Peter is actually the one. If Peter is a self-effacing guy, right, who comes across, as he comes across in the gospel presentations, right? Peter was represented in the book of Mark, warts and all. And Mark never misses an opportunity to highlight where Peter missed an opportunity, right? So Mark's not trying to lionize his hero, Peter, trying to create a two-dimensional image of Peter. He's trying to accurately present what Peter said about himself. Now, let's talk about the date of composition, which we cannot state with any kind of certainty. I have an educated range of 56 to 62. There it is, 56 to 62 A.D. I place the mid-50s. Anything earlier than the mid-50s, the late 40s, it's not likely, because Mark was traveling with Paul. In the late 40s, wiping out with Paul. And in the mid-50s, by the mid-50s, he's disgraced. He's not yet gotten together with Peter that we know of. No indication that we have. We know that he traveled with Barnabas, but he hasn't hooked up yet with Peter, right? And we know, first of all, that the second century church fathers, Papias, and Clement, and Irenaeus, they agree, all of them agree, that Mark's contents are based on Peter's recollections. Not just a quote from Papias. There is disagreement as to whether the gospel was written prior to Peter's death or after Peter's death. That there is disagreement. If the gospel was written after Peter's death, could be then, because Peter died about 62, 63 maybe. So if the gospel is written after Peter's death, well, there you have it. Your date is 62. If is written before, then you have 56 to 62. So you have this little area, an area of time, a window of time when it could be written. Anybody who tells you that it is written way after, like a century after or 2 centuries after, they're simply ignorant of the evidence that we have from Papias and the other church fathers. You can't have a book written after church fathers have told you that the book was already written in the past. So, right, we have to have one and then the others. I hope that's clear to everybody. Now, regarding internal evidence, we know that Luke's gospel is dated 62 to 63 AD, right? Luke's gospel is dated 62, 63 AD, and he's dependent on Mark. Therefore, Mark's gospel cannot have been written after 62 AD. So again, we've got this window of time, very, very important. I don't know how many of you find this information helpful. I find it faith affirming. As I'm honestly, I read a lot of literature and I see a lot of, PBS documentaries and, Discovery Channel documentaries, that argue and state as if it's pontifical truth that the Gospels were written 2 or 3 generations removed from Jesus, and therefore they're not reliable. They're imposing a Greek way of thought upon Jesus and Greek concepts, and they're not very, and I think that's nonsense. And historically, it's untenable. So I find it very faith-affirming to know that within a generation, these things were written. And it makes sense that as these apostles, as these first-generation witnesses were dying off, that these things would be committed to writing and passed on and disseminated to the church as the church began to grow. I hope that's very clear. Now, where is the church that Mark is written? To whom is it written? Most likely, because it doesn't say I'm writing to Roman believers, but most likely it is written to Roman believers. Is there external evidence that it was, because there's no internal evidence, but is there external evidence? How do we know that Mark is writing a gospel to Roman believers? First of all, Rome was a big center, a hot center of Christian activity. That's why Paul wrote an epistle specific. It's his masterpiece. It's the largest of epistles written to the Roman believers. They were very strategic, very, very important. Obviously, that's where Caesar is. Let's see if there's any external evidence that the community to whom Mark wrote were Roman believers. What's the external evidence? First of all, the New Testament epistles. So when we look at external evidence outside the book of Mark, not outside the Bible, but outside the book of Mark. But the New Testament epistles, they place Mark in Rome and or Italy. Okay, let's be honest. From the late 50s to the mid-60s. And I give you several different passages where that is true. Colossians 4 and 2 Timothy 4:11 and Philemon 24 and, of course, 1 Peter 5:23. Although I believe that 1 Peter is being written from Babylon, so not necessarily. He's just right across the Mediterranean Sea in Babylon. So internal evidence that it's written to a Roman or a Gentile, most predominantly Gentile audience. The Aramaic expressions that are used and quoted by the book of Mark, they're translated. Every one of the Aramaic expressions that he quotes, he'll quote them, he'll transliterate them, and say, this means such and such. In other words, he's assuming, and obviously rightly, that his audience would not understand Aramaic. So that takes us out of Israel, that takes us out of Judea, that takes us out of this area, and it puts us into Gentile territory. And secondly, when he mentions Jewish customs, he explains them. There's not a lot that Mark, there's some things that Mark assumes that a well-educated, believing audience, whether they're Jewish or Christian, that they're going to get. But there are several things, several specific Jewish customs that he has to, or he feels constrained that he must explain, So let's see if I can find anything in the text here. There's also several Latin words in there that are inclusion of Latin words. That would indicate a Roman audience. And there's less reliance on messianic prophecies and Old Testament quotations than the other Gospels. So you say, why? Peter, obviously, he knows the prophecies. We see him quoting them in both 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and in the book of Acts, the sermons that are recorded. He's quoting. So Peter knows these messianic prophecies, and he knows the Old Testament quotations, but I believe Mark is being careful not to alienate or to get up over the head of the audience of Roman believers to whom he's writing. So while there are some messianic prophecies, there are some Old Testament quotations, there's less of it than in any other gospel, indicating not a particularly Jewish audience. There may be Jewish people, obviously, in the Roman church, but it is predominantly for a mixed group, not a mixed up group, but a mixed group of Jewish and Gentiles who are believing, who are following the Messiah. What is the purpose? What is the purpose of Mark? Why did he write his book? Why are we going to be spending 40 weeks studying this gospel? Mark wrote to commit to writing as opposed to oral transmission, right? To commit to writing the witness of Peter, the specific stories from Peter, for the purpose of instruction, of instruction and broad dissemination to the Roman churches. So what can we say about why Mark wrote his gospel? He wrote it to commit the writing, the witness of Peter to writing, for the purpose of instruction and broad dissemination for the Roman churches. Mark believed that every audience, every subgroup, every geographic region that had believers were entitled to have a gospel, a story, a historic account of Yeshua in a way, in a means that they could understand and they could put in their back pocket. That's why we need 4 Gospels. We don't need more than 4 Gospels, but we need all 4 Gospels. There's not one that's redundant. And while there's a lot of overlap, you can see, a Venn diagram, especially between the 3 synoptic Gospels, we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that are dependent on one another. We see a lot of overlap between them. There are certain things that each gospel has that the other gospels don't have, and a perspective that helps put the story of Yeshua, the history of our Messiah, not in 3D, but in 4D, in 4 dimensions. We have that colorful, beautiful picture that Mark paints. So he wants to commit to writing the witness of Peter, to disseminate and instruct the Roman churches. What about the theme? What's the theme of the book? No, that's Batman. What's the theme of Mark? Oh, now we get a little bit wordy. Don't get lost in the weeds here. Mark's theme was to topically and thematically present the actions of Jesus, Yeshua, the Messiah. Hang on. When I say to topically and thematically, that would be in contradistinction to chronologically, let's say. This is not a chronological presentation of the story of Jesus. It is a topical, it is a thematic presentation of the actions of Yeshua, of Jesus, the Messiah, so as to portray him in a certain light. What light? As God's suffering servant. Why would Mark want to do that? For the purpose of provoking the reader to a reaction of faith. Well, what do you mean a reaction of faith? Talk plain English, please, Steve. In other words, he wants to provoke them to become followers of Messiah. Right? So, it's topical. It's a thematic presentation of the actions. Notice the actions, not the words or the teachings of Yeshua. This is an action gospel. It's not that Jesus is silent. It's that this is a story. First this happened, and then this happened, and this, and Jesus did this, and Jesus did this. And by the way, he said this, but let's move on to his actions. So, topically, thematically, action gospel, to portray him in what light? As a suffering servant. Why does he write this whole thing? To provoke the reader to become followers of Messiah. Wants to provoke a reaction. He's not just writing for his health. He's not just writing for posterity. He's writing specifically with a purpose. So you can actually think of the Gospels as propaganda. Not propaganda in a negative, manipulative, untrue claims, but for the purpose of moving. I'm not just presenting evidence here. I'm presenting evidence with a purpose for you to be convinced. So that's how he's doing. And he does it differently than Luke or Matthew or John. So Jesus is not just the servant of God in the book of the book of Mark. He is God's suffering servant. He is God's suffering servant. So, let me boil this down, wrap it up. How many of you, nobody does this anymore, photo albums. Nobody does photo albums anymore, I know. But nonetheless, some of us still do some sort of scrapbooking to create mementos of events or our time on vacation or something like that. How many of you do scrapbooking? Raise your, all right, get out. All right, there's no cooperation whatsoever. What are you all, very academic? Is that to say nobody's doing scrap? What are you doing? You're taking pictures on your iPhones and you're just collecting hundreds and thousands of photos that are unorganized and disassembled on your computer on a hard drive? And you're hoping that it doesn't fail because you have the iCloud backing it up, which you never check and you never look? Is that what we have? How many people do that? Yeah, okay, quite a few of you. All right, well. Mark is old school. And just as there are ways that we can make scrapbooks, different ways. One way that we could do a scrapbook is, let's say, Adria and I went on a Viking cruise in 2019 for our, was it 25? It was the 25th anniversary, I think. 25, 26, yeah, 25, 26. Anyway, went on a Viking cruise to Europe. So I could come back, and we took a lot of pictures, whatever. But if I were a scrapbooker, I could do it several different ways. I could present, this is us, page 1. This is us getting on the plane. This is us getting off the plane. This is where we spent our first night in Holland, in Amsterdam. We then proceeded on the boat. We spent the night in the boat, in the harbor there, whatever. And then we went the second day. Here are the windmills that we saw, Kinderdijk. And then from there, we sailed down the Rhine, and we wound up in Cologne, whatever. That's the city, not the fragrance. And then from there, piece by piece, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, a chronological presentation. Right? Or I could present, here's all the times that we were on the airplane. Okay, that's good. Let's get out of the way. Okay, now here's everything we did in Holland. Okay, here's everything we did in Germany. Here's everything we did in France. Here's what we did in Switzerland. And then the next page is going to show you all the different food that we ate, all the meals that we had in every different country. And see, everything would be organized topically and thematically, right? But it's out of order. It's not correct. And that's what we're going to see with the Gospel of Mark. So if you're looking for chronology, you got to go to Luke, okay? Because you won't see it here in John. In Mark. In John, what you'll see is everything is organized in relation to the Jewish calendar and to Jewish holidays. So everybody's got their own little niche. Everybody's got their own shtick, their own gimmick as they present the gospel. But Mark's is very interesting in how he arranges it, because the topics and the themes that he wants us to pay attention to have a direct bearing on the response that he wants us to have. So, when we get into the book of Mark together, I don't think I have anything else to say. Here, okay, some more scrapbook stuff, yeah. When we find ourselves in the book of Mark for the next 39 weeks now, you may be surprised at what is included in Mark's gospel, and even more surprised at what is excluded. I'll give you a sneak preview. One of the things that one might expect to find in the Gospel of Mark, that you won't find, look though you might, is any Christmas type story, birth narrative, no angelic annunciation, no dreams from Joseph, no betrothal of Mary and Joseph, nothing about Nazareth, nothing. We're going to start this book. Yeshua has already grown up. He's already starting his ministry. Right? You got no flight to Egypt. You got no destruction of the Jewish children in Bethlehem, the babies. No wise men. No shepherds. Nothing like that. It's an action gospel. And so from verse 1, and you're going to have to be ready to do this, from verse 1, you snap into action with Mark. So I hope that in time to come, you will be ready as we snap into action with the Gospel of Mark as we take this Jewish journey.